She met 7 sitting American presidents, outlasted 12 British prime ministers, and spent 70 years insisting she had no political power whatsoever. That last part was, to put it gently, a careful arrangement of the truth. Every president who sat across from her at Balmoral walked in with 4 years of ambition and walked out having spoken with a woman who personally remembered how the Cuban Missile Crisis felt from inside a functioning government. She controlled nothing through force and everything through memory, through continuity, through the particular authority of being the only person in the room who had simply been there before. So how did the most powerful woman of the 20th century convince the world she was purely ceremonial? And why did every American president quietly keep coming back? The Rolls-Royce door closed with a sound like a library at midnight. Solid. Final. The kind of sound that reminded you, without saying a word, that you were entering a different category of serious. This is where we begin. Not with a conspiracy, not with secret cables or coded telegrams. With a drawing room, a pot of tea brewed to a temperature most Americans would find aggressively lukewarm, and a woman sitting in a chair who had been sitting in chairs like this since 1952. The bone china was minted. The quiet was absolute. And the newly elected President of the United States, whatever year you choose, whatever name you prefer, was about to have a conversation he had been warned about and still was not prepared for. She remembered his predecessor. She remembered his predecessor's predecessor. She remembered, with some fondness, the man 3 presidents before that, and she had a rather pointed opinion about the one before him that she would never share publicly, which was itself a form of power. Here is the central paradox at the heart of this story. Elizabeth II, Queen of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth, was constitutionally forbidden from exercising political power. She could not vote. She could not endorse. She could not, in any formal sense, tell the leader of the free world what to do. Her role was ceremonial, her influence officially non-existent, her opinions constitutionally irrelevant. And yet, every president from Harry Truman to Joseph Biden made the pilgrimage. 14 of them. 13 if you are being technical about Truman's visit and what qualified as an audience. They came in their best suits, trailing aides and anxious protocol officers, and they sat across from her in rooms that smelled of old roses and older money, and they talked. Don't worry about what they said. We'll get to that. The point for now is that they kept coming back. Why? The honest answer is the one that takes a moment to fully land. She remembered everything. In a political world built on 4-year attention spans, on the brutal amnesia of election cycles, on advisors who were born after the Berlin Wall fell, she was the only leader on earth carrying a 70-year continuous memory of what actually happened. She had watched empires dissolve over biscuits. She had seen the Cold War begin and end and begin arguing with itself again. She knew which promises sounded different in a palace than they did in a press release. That is not conspiracy. That is something far more unsettling. That is institutional memory with a crown on. Secretly controlled is perhaps too dramatic a phrase. She would have found it too dramatic, but quietly shaped, gently redirected, allowed powerful men to believe they were confiding in a grandmother while she cataloged every word with the patience of someone who had absolutely nowhere else to be? That we can work with. The woman in the chair outlasted all of them. And that, as it turns out, was the whole strategy. Walter Bagehot was a Victorian journalist with spectacular sideburns and the rare gift of explaining the British Constitution to people who had assumed, reasonably, that there wasn't one. In 1867, he published The English Constitution, a book that sounds dry and reads like someone calmly describing a controlled explosion. In it, he laid out the 3 things a constitutional monarch actually gets to do: the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, the right to warn. That's the complete list. 3 modest verbs. You could fit them on a bookmark. Prime ministers have lost sleep over all 3. Consider what's missing from that list: the right to command, the right to veto, the right to make anyone do anything whatsoever. Gone. Constitutionally unavailable. The monarch is, in formal terms, a very well-dressed suggestion box. And yet Bacot's framework survived 150 years because it understood something that job titles don't capture. Encouragement from someone who has seen 17 prime ministers cycle through the same anxious posture in the same gilded chair carries a different weight than encouragement from a colleague. Warning from someone who personally remembers the last time this exact plan was tried and watched it fail quietly over a plate of sandwiches is not a gentle word. It is a cold hand on the shoulder. The mechanism for all of this was Tuesday. Every Tuesday that Parliament was in session, the Prime Minister arrived at Buckingham Palace for the weekly audience. No staff, no notes, no recording devices. The 2 of them, alone, for somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, and not a single transcript has ever been confirmed to exist. In 70 years of audiences, nothing leaked. Not from her side. Barely a whisper from theirs. Think about what that room contained, acoustically speaking. The soft tick of clocks that cost more than most houses. The particular silence of thick carpets absorbing every footstep, every nervous shuffle. And across from the Prime Minister, a woman who had sat in that same chair for the conversation about Suez, about the Falklands, about every crisis that now lived in textbooks. She could not command. But she could remember, and she could say with perfect composure and no notes at all, that she recalled a similar proposal in roughly 1973, and how did that conclude? The Prime Minister, who was perhaps born in 1973, would have no immediate answer. Memory, deployed with patience and impeccable manners, is not soft power. It is the original power. The elected officials changed. She remained. And every Tuesday, the institution updated its files. The presidents, of course, didn't get Tuesdays. They got something rarer and considerably more carefully managed. Harry Truman had survived the Depression, a world war, and Washington politics, which is to say he was not a man who impressed easily. Then he met Princess Elizabeth. The year was 1951. Elizabeth was 25, standing in for her father George VI, whose lungs were failing quietly behind Buckingham Palace's closed curtains. She arrived in Washington as a proxy, a placeholder, a young woman politely pretending the empire was not visibly fraying at the edges. The Cold War had turned everything into theater, and here was the grandest theater of all. A princess in white gloves, charming a haberdasher's son from Missouri who had dropped 2 atomic bombs and still called himself a plain-spoken man. The thing is, it worked. After Elizabeth departed, Truman sat down and wrote her a personal letter. Not a formal diplomatic note. A letter. In it, he called her a fairy princess who had made even the most hardened corners of official Washington believe, briefly, in something. Consider that sentence. This was Harry Truman, the man whose desk held a sign declaring the buck stopped there. And yet here he was, producing language that belonged in a children's book, because apparently no other vocabulary fit what had just happened to him. The letter tells you everything about what Elizabeth understood that everyone around her underestimated. American presidents were not accustomed to deference. They commanded rooms through volume, office, and the particular electricity of democratic mandate. Elizabeth had none of those tools and didn't need them. She had stillness. She had attention. She made people feel, with no effort that was visible to the naked eye, that what they were saying mattered enormously to someone who had heard everything. 3 months later, in February of 1952, George VI died in his sleep, and Elizabeth became queen at 25, inheriting an empire that was quietly renegotiating its own existence and a Cold War world that wanted to know exactly where Britain stood. The answer, largely, was wherever Elizabeth decided to stand, with composure and pearls and no particular hurry. What Truman noticed in that visit became the template. Every American president who followed would meet her expecting ceremony and leave having experienced something considerably more disorienting. She would smile, ask a precise question, and somewhere in the answer they would realize they were not in charge of this particular conversation. They all underestimated her exactly once. Which brings us to the man who followed Truman, a general who thought he understood dignity and protocol, and discovered that Elizabeth had been practicing both since before he commanded anything. Dwight Eisenhower arrived at Balmoral Castle in August of 1959 with 5 stars on his shoulder and a reputation for organizing the liberation of Western Europe, and Elizabeth fed him drop scones. This was not accidental. The relationship had roots that predated Elizabeth's reign entirely. Eisenhower had been a fixture in wartime London, working alongside her father George VI during the darkest possible stretch of the 1940s, sharing the particular bond that forms between people who have planned for catastrophe together in cold rooms. When Elizabeth became queen, Eisenhower did not meet a stranger. He met the daughter of a man he had respected enormously, and she knew it. And she used it, with great warmth and absolutely no apology. The 1959 Balmoral visit was technically informal. That informality was the entire point. Balmoral sits in the Aberdeenshire Hills, 50 miles from Aberdeen and considerably further from anything resembling a press corps. The stone is cold to the touch, even in August. The air smells of heather and wood smoke and the particular dampness that Scotland considers summer. There are no photographers permitted. There are no protocol officers hovering with talking points. There is, famously, a fireplace and the Queen's own cooking, and that year there were drop scones made from a recipe Elizabeth had developed herself. Don't worry. It gets more geopolitically significant. Eisenhower ate the scones. He ate them with apparent delight. And then, later Elizabeth wrote him a letter containing the recipe, a chatty, warm, handwritten document that survives in the Eisenhower Presidential Library and reads like correspondence between old friends who happen to, in passing, determine the direction of Western alliances. This is what no protocol officer had planned for and no foreign ministry could replicate. The letter was domesticity as diplomacy, a recipe as a dispatch. The message underneath the butter and self-raising flour was something closer to. We understand each other, and we will continue to understand each other, and here is a document that proves we once ate breakfast together. The conversations at Balmoral that weekend covered the aftermath of Suez, which had humiliated Britain 3 years earlier and required considerable diplomatic reconstruction, and the evolving architecture of NATO in a world where the Soviet Union had recently made clear it intended to be uncomfortable at every available opportunity. These were not topics that could be discussed with cameras present or in the formal choreography of a state dinner, where every word is pre-approved and every gesture is photographed and analyzed by 17 different intelligence agencies before dessert arrives. In a drafty Scottish castle eating scones, with the fire going and no one watching, 2 people who genuinely liked each other could simply talk. That was the blueprint. Remote location. No press. enforced casualness that lowered every guard a formal setting would have raised. And at the center of it, Elizabeth, who had been practicing the art of the precise question and the meaningful silence since long before Eisenhower pinned his first star. The template she built with Eisenhower would outlast his presidency by decades, and the next man to sit across from her would find the Balmoral atmosphere equally disarming, though his particular experience of it was considerably more complicated. The dinner at Buckingham Palace on the 5th of June, 1961, was the collision of two entirely different theories about what elegance meant. Jackie Kennedy arrived in a gown by Hubert de Givenchy, spoke flawless French to General de Gaulle across the table, and radiated a particular kind of American glamour that had been making European heads of state slightly dizzy for weeks. The room smelled of hothouse flowers and silver polish. Chandeliers threw light across crystal that had survived 2 world wars. And at the center of it all, the Queen of England, 35 years old, wearing the weight of an institution rather than the cut of a couture house. Jackie was not impressed. She said so later, privately, to Gore Vidal. Buckingham Palace was second-rate, she told him. The furnishings dreary, the atmosphere stiff. She had expected majesty and found, in her estimation, a kind of magnificent stuffiness. It was an ungenerous read. It was also absolutely the wrong move, because Jackie said it to Gore Vidal, and Gore Vidal eventually said it to everyone. Elizabeth knew. These things always got back. Her response was not a counterstrike. It was something considerably more unsettling. She was warmer, more patient, more genuinely curious about Jackie than Jackie had expected, or perhaps deserved. She refused to compete on glamour, which was smart, because that was a contest with no dignified exit. Instead, she competed on something Jackie hadn't prepared for: simple, unhurried graciousness. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The Queen had been practicing it since her coronation in 1953, and she was very, very good at it by now. Imagine trying to sustain contempt for someone who keeps being quietly, inexhaustibly kind to you. It is profoundly difficult. Then came November 22nd, 1963, and everything else became irrelevant overnight. The Kennedy assassination hit Britain like a physical blow. Crowds gathered outside the American embassy in London's Grosvenor Square, leaving flowers in the November cold, standing in silence because there was nothing else to do. Elizabeth, by any protocol of the era, was not required to do very much at all. Kennedy had been a foreign president, not a Commonwealth leader, not a head of state whose death traditionally commanded British ceremonial mourning. She ordered the tenor bell at Westminster Abbey tolled. It is an almost unprecedented gesture for a foreign leader. The sound of that bell, low and deliberate over London, was a signal to anyone paying attention. This loss mattered here, and the Queen was saying so publicly in the oldest language she had available. Which brings us to the arithmetic that no one in the Kennedy administration had fully computed. John Kennedy served 1,036 days as president. By the morning of his assassination, Elizabeth had already been queen for 11 years. She had known 4 presidents. She would know 7 more. The Kennedys had arrived as the most glamorous couple on earth and rewritten the rules of political celebrity. And Elizabeth had simply waited and been kind and outlasted them. Presidents, it turns out, are mortal in more ways than one. The next man to discover this was a Texan who understood power very differently and found the Queen considerably harder to charm than he had expected. Lyndon Baines Johnson arrived at every room like a weather system, loud and warm and slightly threatening, the way a Texas summer is warm. Elizabeth had been briefed, of course. She was always briefed. But intelligence reports and the actual physical presence of a 6'4" man who greeted foreign dignitaries by grabbing their lapels were two different things. Their 1965 meeting was a study in contrasting gravitational fields. LBJ pulled everything toward him. The Queen, by long practice, simply remained exactly where she was. Immovable, gracious, faintly amused if you knew where to look. What almost no one knew at the time was what Elizabeth was reading between meetings. British intelligence assessments of Vietnam, routed through channels that connected Whitehall directly to the palace, were giving her a picture of the war that most American senators weren't receiving. She understood the quagmire before the word became fashionable. She said nothing publicly, which was the point. Don't worry, it gets worse. Richard Nixon, who arrived next, was the most complicated American she'd handled so far. He was a genuine Anglophile, the sort of man who quoted Churchill at dinner and meant it with embarrassing sincerity. In 1970, he visited Buckingham Palace and did something that still inspires a kind of bewildered fondness in historians. He suggested, apparently seriously, that his daughter Tricia might make a suitable match for Prince Charles. The Queen's response to this proposal has not been documented in any public record. One imagines a very composed silence, the diplomatic equivalent of a closed door. Charles was 21. Tricia Nixon was 24. The geopolitical implications would have been extraordinary. The wedding china alone would have been a crisis. Then came Watergate. Here is where Elizabeth's constitutional training became something close to a superpower. A monarch who comments on the internal politics of an allied nation is a monarch making an enemy. So she said nothing. Publicly, cleanly, completely nothing, while a sitting American president unraveled on television screens worldwide, and the special relationship hung in careful suspension. Her silence was so pointed, so deliberate, that diplomatic observers noted it as a statement in itself. Saying nothing, it turns out, can echo very loudly across the Atlantic if you are the Queen of England and everyone is watching for your reaction. Gerald Ford stumbled into this silence in August of 1974 and found, to his surprise, a woman who was genuinely kind to him. Elizabeth had a habit, noticed by those in her household, of calibrating her warmth to need rather than status. Ford was decent. He was honest. He was almost certainly not ready for what had landed on him. She recognized this the way you recognize tiredness in someone's eyes before they've mentioned it. Their meetings carried a quality that her interactions with Johnson and Nixon had not. Something resembling straightforward human sympathy. She had identified a pattern that would serve her through 7 presidencies. Political skill was temporary. Character, however imperfect, was the thing worth paying attention to. And she had all the time in the world to keep watching. The next man would arrive with a peanut farmer's handshake, a nuclear engineer's brain, and an evangelical sincerity that would present Elizabeth with an entirely different kind of challenge. In June of 1982, 2 expert riders walked their horses across the grounds of Windsor Home Park, and the Cold War briefly looked almost pleasant. Ronald Reagan had arrived in Britain on the 9th, midway through a European tour, midway through the Falklands War, and roughly midway through a presidency that would outlast the Soviet Union by about 8 years, though nobody knew the last part yet. What the cameras captured that morning was something genuinely rare in the theater of international diplomacy. 2 people who were not performing ease, but actually feeling it. Reagan was a horseman, the way Elizabeth was a horsewoman. Completely, instinctively, without requiring applause. The horses moved quietly through the mist. The Falklands raged 7,000 miles south. The image that came back to the watching world was of a president and a queen who appeared, improbably, to be enjoying themselves. Here is the thing about performances that look effortless. They never are. Elizabeth had spent 40 years learning to make duty look like preference. Reagan had spent 40 years learning to make preparation look like instinct. Put them together on horseback at Windsor and you got two consummate professionals recognizing each other across species, which is perhaps the rarest form of international relations. That evening, inside the castle, Nancy Reagan experienced what multiple members of her staff would later describe as sustained architectural awe. The state dinner moved through gilded rooms that made the White House look recently built. Reagan himself was, by all accounts, entirely relaxed. Elizabeth's private observation, shared with members of her household, was that he was the first president since Eisenhower she genuinely looked forward to talking with. Not because he was the cleverest man in the room, because he was honest about which things he found funny, and he found quite a lot of things funny, and so did she. Don't worry, it gets worse. Specifically, it gets worse in October of 1983 when American forces invaded Grenada. Grenada was a Commonwealth nation. The Queen was its head of state. The United States did not tell her this was coming. It did not tell Margaret Thatcher either, which produced one of the more spectacular telephone conversations of the decade, details of which Thatcher later recalled with the controlled fury of someone describing a car accident they had personally predicted. Elizabeth's displeasure was expressed through considerably colder channels, communicated with the precision of someone who had spent 4 decades choosing every word for maximum weight and minimum volume. Reagan knew he had miscalculated. The relationship survived because it was built on something that could absorb a miscalculation. Genuine mutual regard, established on horseback the previous summer, reinforced at dinner, and operating through a triangle that was quietly reshaping the final decade of the Cold War. The Reagan-Thatcher-Elizabeth structure was not formal. It had no treaty, no charter, no memoranda of understanding filed in any archive. What it had was 3 people who shared a basic conviction about how the world should be organized and a collective talent for making that conviction feel like inevitability. Thatcher supplied the ideological fuel. Reagan supplied the spectacle and the strategic weight. Elizabeth supplied something neither of them could produce alone: continuity. She had been there before either of them arrived. She would be there after both of them left. She was the fixed point around which the alliance rotated, and everyone involved understood this even if no one said it plainly. The Cold War's final act was already being drafted in the early 1980s, though the cast didn't know their cues yet. What the Windsor horseback ride actually captured beneath the pleasant optics was the moment the Atlantic Alliance stopped feeling fragile and started feeling, for the first time in years, like something that might last long enough to win. Elizabeth had watched Johnson bluster, Nixon calculate, Ford recover, and Carter arrive with his careful sincerity. Reagan was different. Reagan understood, as she did, that what countries believe about themselves matters as much as what countries actually possess. That particular insight would carry them both quite a long way before the curtain finally came down. Next came the end of the Cold War itself, a new generation, and a president who would test the special relationship in ways Windsor's riding paths couldn't prepare anyone for. Every morning of her reign, without exception, a locked red leather box arrived at whatever residence Elizabeth happened to be occupying. The boxes were not large. Roughly the size of a generous briefcase, stamped in gold with the royal cipher, worn smooth at the corners from decades of handling. Inside, the day's classified correspondence, cabinet papers, foreign office telegrams, and the kind of material that, if you found it on a park bench, would change your understanding of the world considerably. Elizabeth signed a receipt. She read everything. Then she did it again the next day. For 70 years. Think about what that actually means in accumulated terms. Not the romance of it, the sheer volume. Every significant British foreign policy decision, Every diplomatic maneuver, every intelligence assessment about every major power on Earth, landing in the same pair of hands, in the same locked box, day after day after decade after decade. By the early 1990s, the quiet consensus among senior Whitehall officials was something they would not say publicly but understood privately. No living person had read more classified material than Elizabeth II. Not the Prime Minister, not the Cabinet Secretary, not the Director General of MI5. Her. Because Prime Ministers come and go. The boxes stay. The intelligence briefings added another layer entirely. MI5 and MI6 both maintained separate briefing channels to the palace, which meant Elizabeth received parallel assessments of world events that operated independently of whatever her prime minister was seeing. She knew what British intelligence believed about American political developments. She knew it in detail. She knew it through sources and methods that never appeared in any newspaper. The American president she met across 5 decades did not know the precise depth of what she knew. That asymmetry, quiet and carefully maintained, was not accidental. The Foreign Office cables completed the picture. Encrypted telegrams from the Washington embassy, carrying the texture of real diplomacy rather than its public face. The faint crinkle of those decoded pages represented something no briefing book could replicate. The unguarded observations of diplomats who believed they were writing only for each other. Elizabeth read those too. What this produced over time was an advisor of extraordinary singular depth. Think tanks rotate staff. Intelligence agencies promote people sideways. Governments change. Elizabeth simply continued, adding each year's worth of secrets to the previous years, building a picture of the world that no institution and no individual could match through any normal process. By the time the Cold War ended and a new generation of American leadership arrived, she had been reading their country's secrets through British eyes for longer than most of them had been in politics. That context would matter more than anyone expected. George Herbert Walker Bush had served in the Pacific at 19, and when he sat across from Elizabeth in the early 1990s, something almost unspoken passed between them. They were the last of a particular kind. The same war. The same formative cold. The same understanding that the world had nearly ended once and had been held together largely through exhausting, unglamorous effort. Bush called her visits the most comfortable conversations I have in this entire job, which, given that his job included the Gulf War, says rather a lot. He meant it as a compliment. He was also simply telling the truth. Bill Clinton arrived at Buckingham Palace in 1995 with considerably less of that ease. He was young, visually charismatic, and absolutely certain that warmth and intellect would carry any room. He was not wrong, exactly. But Elizabeth had seen warmth and intellect before. She had been collecting it since 1953. The initial audience was reportedly stiff in the particular way that only confident people can manage, where the effort to seem relaxed becomes its own kind of tension. The gilded walls, the faint smell of old roses and wax polish, the footmen positioned at angles that suggested careful choreography. Clinton smiled. Elizabeth waited. Then she simply began talking to him. Not about policy. About people. About leaders she had watched across 40 years, the ones who lasted and the ones who didn't, and what the difference usually was. By the end, Clinton was leaning forward in his chair. By the third visit, aides noted he requested the audience be extended. The skeptic had been converted through the oldest possible method, being genuinely listened to by someone who had heard everything. Don't worry. It gets better. Then it gets worse. September 11th, 2001. The news traveled to Balmoral on a Tuesday afternoon. Elizabeth gave one instruction that mattered more than any formal statement. At the changing of the guard the following morning, the band would play the Star-Spangled Banner. It had never been done. The tradition stretches back centuries, the scarlet coats, the precise choreography, the whole magnificent weight of continuity. And in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, with tourists and mourners pressed together along the railings, the first notes of the American anthem rose into the London air. Grown men wept. Diplomats wept. A woman from Ohio who had been visiting for entirely different reasons wept, and later said she had never felt so unexpectedly held by a country that was not her own. George W. Bush provided the chapter's comic relief, and to his considerable credit, he was good-natured about it. At the White House State Dinner in 2007, he misspoke while toasting the Queen, constructing a sentence that implied she had witnessed the American bicentennial in 1776. He caught himself mid-flourish. The pause stretched. Elizabeth turned to him slowly, with the expression of a woman who had indeed seen rather a lot, and delivered a single raised eyebrow that rescued the entire evening. She had, by that point, been doing this for 54 years. The eyebrow was practiced. What remained consistent across all four of these men was not loyalty, exactly, or even affection, though both were present. It was something quieter, the recognition that they were sitting with someone who had context they would never fully access. The nature of that context and how it shaped the most private moments of the relationship is where things get genuinely interesting. Barack Obama arrived at Buckingham Palace in April of 2009 carrying a gift the British press would spend approximately 48 hours gleefully mocking: a personalized iPod. The mockery was understandable on the surface. Here was the leader of the free world presenting the 82-year-old Queen of England with a piece of consumer electronics. Columnists had a field day. The word tacky appeared in print more times than anyone needed. What the columnists did not know, and what took years to fully surface, was what the iPod actually contained. Photographs and video from Obama's inauguration, recordings of songs performed during Elizabeth's previous state visits to the United States, and a playlist assembled with the kind of attention that suggests someone had done their homework very, very carefully. She reportedly listened to it regularly. The iPod was not a gaffe. It was, in fact, one of the more intimate gifts any president had ever given her, wrapped in the least impressive packaging imaginable. That same summit produced the photograph. Michelle Obama, tall and warm and entirely unintimidated by centuries of protocol, put her arm around the Queen. Elizabeth, to the visible astonishment of every courtier in the room, put her arm around Michelle in return. Royal protocol on physical contact is not a suggestion. It is a system. It has survived wars. It blinked just once in that room because the chemistry was apparently stronger than the rulebook. 2 years later, in 2011, Obama returned for a full state visit. The formal dinner at Buckingham Palace, the careful toasts, the mutual admiration conducted in the particular language of people who choose their words the way jewelers choose settings. Obama was precise. Elizabeth was precise. Two people who understood that what you don't say carries weight equal to what you do. Observers noted it looked less like a diplomatic obligation and more like two old colleagues comparing notes. There was something almost poignant operating beneath all of it. Obama was the 12th president of Elizabeth's reign, which is already a number that requires a moment of silence. He was also the first born after her coronation. She had been queen since February of 1952. Obama was born in August of 1961. When she took the throne, His parents had not yet met. The generational gap was not merely wide, it was almost geological. And yet the photographs from that state visit show two people in genuine conversation, genuinely present with each other, with none of the performance fatigue visible in so many official portraits. Consider what she carried into that room. 59 years of state visits, crises, inaugurations, and funerals. The cold smell of a post-war London. Churchill's cigar smoke, probably still somewhere in the drapery of her memory. And across the table, a man for whom all of that history was, by birth, simply history. That she found warmth in it rather than distance says something worth sitting with. The golden hour of her American relationships was quieter than the earlier chapters, less theatrical, more earned. But every relationship must eventually make room for what comes after warmth. The final chapters have a different temperature entirely. On the afternoon of July 13, 2018, Donald Trump walked ahead of Queen Elizabeth II during an inspection of the honor guard at Windsor Castle. Not beside her. Not slightly ahead. Ahead, in the particular way of someone who has never once considered that he might not be the most important person in a room. The Queen, 82 years of practice in her posture, kept her composure so completely that only the photographs betrayed what had happened. British tabloids treated it roughly the way they treat an invasion. She had survived Churchill's condescension, Nixon's sycophancy, Reagan's gentle forgetfulness, and Bush II's nickname. She had navigated 59 years of American presidents, each one different, each one requiring a slightly different calibration. The system had always worked because every player, however imperfect, understood the game was being played. What happens when one player doesn't know there is a game? Don't worry. It gets worse. She wore the brooch the Obamas had given her on the day Trump arrived. If you think that was coincidence, you have not been paying attention to this woman for the last 10 chapters. She then wore a brooch gifted by Canada during a period when Trump had publicly insulted Canada's Prime Minister and threatened its trade relationships. She then produced, for his company, a brooch she had previously worn to funerals. 3 brooches. 3 consecutive, silent, devastating editorials delivered in jewelry form. No press conference required. No statement issued. Just a woman in her 90s broadcasting her opinions in a frequency that the entire world could receive except, apparently, the intended audience. The sheer elegance of it should stop you cold. She had spent 70 years perfecting a method of influence built on restraint, symbol, and the long game. Here it was, fully operational, humming with precision. The brooches were not petty. They were the system working exactly as designed. The 2019 state visit added a different layer. During the formal banquet toast, Elizabeth offered words praising the institutions of international cooperation, the alliances built after the Second World War, the architecture of multilateral diplomacy that her entire reign had helped maintain. She looked directly at her guest and said it warmly, graciously, with the particular warmth that experienced diplomats recognize immediately as a warning. Even the Washington press corps noticed. The Financial Times noticed. Everyone noticed, politely. And this is where the system began to show its seams. Soft power is a conversation. It requires 2 parties willing to speak the same language, even when they disagree. Elizabeth had maintained her influence across 7 decades by being indispensable to a dialogue, the steady, trusted voice that American presidents sought out precisely because she operated outside their political noise. She was the one person in the relationship who would never want something from them, never run against them, never appear on a rival network. That neutrality was the source of the power. But the brooch strategy, brilliant as it was also a sign. She was not influencing. She was commenting. The audience had shifted from the president to everyone watching the president. The method had not failed exactly, but it had been forced to change shape, and that change revealed something about the shape it had always been. The fragility was never in Elizabeth. It was in the assumption that every occupant of the Oval Office would bring a minimum of diplomatic vocabulary to the table. 70 years of evidence had made that assumption feel like bedrock. The Trump visits revealed it as something closer to a fortunate streak. She adapted as she always had. The brooches landed. The toast landed. The tabloids and the press corps and the diplomats all read the signals correctly because they were fluent. Whether any of it changed anything is a different question and a harder one. What the Trump visits ultimately proved is that Elizabeth's system was a masterpiece of its kind, built for a world that mostly still existed, held together by one woman's extraordinary discipline and, increasingly, by her willingness to fight with whatever quiet weapons she had left. Next, we ask what all of it added up to. On September 19, 2022, Joe Biden sat in Westminster Abbey among 500 heads of state and dignitaries, row 7 behind European royalty, which is its own kind of diplomatic commentary. He had been the last sitting American president to meet her. 15 months earlier, at the Group of 7 summit in Cornwall, June of 2021, she had received the leaders on the clifftops above the sea, the salt air coming in off the Atlantic, and she had been, by every account, completely at ease. 95 years old, unhurried, doing the things she had done for 70 years as though time had simply declined to apply to her. Biden had leaned in close during photographs, and she had laughed at something he said genuinely, which is not something every president managed. And then, 14 months and 22 days later, she was gone. The Abbey smelled of old stone and flowers and the particular weight of occasion. Westminster always does. But something in the architecture of the moment was different, and the diplomats in attendance would have felt it the way you feel a draft through a window you cannot find. The woman who remembered Suez was not there. She had been at the table in some form for every major rupture and repair in Anglo-American relations since 1952. Every crisis had eventually reached a moment where her presence, her continuity, her institutional memory of how the last crisis ended provided something no briefing document could replicate. She knew these men. She had known their fathers. She had, in some cases, known their fathers' predecessors. That is not a relationship. That is an archive with a pulse. Charles III inherited the throne with genuine warmth, real intelligence, and decades of his own diplomatic work. None of that is nothing. But a web built over 70 years is not transferable. You cannot inherit a relationship. You can only begin one, and beginning takes time that crises do not wait for. The Anglo-American relationship in late 2022 entered turbulence almost immediately. Trade negotiations stalled. The special relationship, always more of a feeling than a legal structure, began to feel like something people were describing from memory rather than experience. News cycles moved on in 48 hours. Twitter had opinions and then forgot them. 4-year election windows meant that institutional knowledge on the American side reset on a reliable schedule. Here is the cost nobody priced in. When no one at the table remembers what happened last time, everyone is, in some small and dangerous way, improvising. Elizabeth had been the living correction to that improvisation. A quiet voice that knew specifically how 1956 ended, how 1962 ended, how the difficult years always eventually resolved because she had watched them resolve. That knowledge does not live in a memo. it lives in a person. She had held the seam of the relationship together through patience, memory, and an almost supernatural consistency, not because it was her job, exactly, but because she was the only one left who could. The room after she left it is where we have been living ever since. What she built, what it protected, and what it cost to keep it going for 7 decades, that is where we end.